Good morning. Barry Bryson here. Thank you for joining me for another 5 good minutes with the Word. We're continuing our study of the Gospel of Matthew. We're in chapter 13, in the middle of the parables sermon. And we've already talked about those two long parables that receive explanation in the text, the parable of the sower and the parable of the weeds. What remains in chapter 13 are three pairs of parables. Two parables that focus on growth, two parables that focus on value, and two parables that focus on discernment. And the parables are connected to each other in topic, but they each shine a light on a different aspect of the truth about growth or about value or about discernment as it applies to the kingdom of God. So we're going to read verses 31 through 33 today, the parable of the mustard seed and the parable of the leaven. He presented another parable to them, saying, "The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed, which a man took and sowed in his field. This is smaller than all seeds, but when it is full grown, it is larger than the garden plants, and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the air and nest come and nest in its branches." He spoke another parable to them. "The kingdom of heaven is like leaven, which a woman took and hid in 3 pecks of meal until it was all leavened." Okay, he's talking about the mustard seed, which is a tiny, tiny seed. You'll have commentators point out that the orchid seed is smaller, and therefore when Jesus says it's the smallest seed, that's not exactly scientifically true, and also that mustard is not a tree. It's a shrub. It's a big shrub. It's a very big shrub, but it's not technically a tree. All I have to say to that is that human taxonomy is a human construct, and the words that we make up for things are words we make up. So what Jesus was saying was perfectly true in terms of the categories that they themselves were using. Okay, so we have two things, and both of these are about growth. That's clear. Now, he doesn't explain these. He expects us to get them. The kingdom of God is going to be like the mustard seed. It's going to be small, but the growth is going to be large. It's going to come from obscure beginnings, but it's going to become large and significant and sturdy, inclusive. It's going to be a place of provision, of protection, and the place that can serve as a home for living things, a variety of living things. We could think about that all day, how the church is like that. But that's what he says the church is going to be like, and that's exactly what history tells us about the growth of the church. Started from very humble beginnings, a bunch of guys mostly from Galilee, and Christianity is the most recognizable, the most widespread, the most adhered to in a secular sense, religion in the history of the world. I mean, that's just, more people call themselves Christian than have called themselves anything else, ever. 1/3 of the human population calls themselves Christian at this time in our history. So, the second parable is the parable of the leaven. I love the way Jesus balances out much of the time the examples from the life of a man and the examples from the life of a woman. Of course, this is the one example from a woman's life that he gives here in chapter 13, but he does give one. Make sure that he includes, what his women listeners, something from their own lives, and he talks about making bread and what is more basic to their life, these day laborers, than the gathering of grain and the making of bread. It's what sustained them. It's their main food source. And they didn't have yeast back in those days, or they weren't using it. They would take a pinch of dough, and it would be wet, and they would put it in the corner, cover it up, and they would let it ferment, and then they would use that as a leavening agent to make the bread rise. And so it only take a little bit. In fact, if you ate a lot of it, you'd be very, very sick because you'd be eating rotten bread. But the little bit that they would work into a larger lump would make the whole lump rise. And the point here is that the smaller agent is the powerful agent because it is the active agent. And that's always true. If you have 100 people and 98 of them are apathetic, but 2 of them are active and can whip everybody else up into shape, you're going to be okay. And he's already established that most people are not going to respond to the gospel. But he's telling us here that even though our numbers comparatively are small, we are mighty. like Hermia, in A Midsummer Night's Dream. That's who we are. And it's just the case that the active agent is much smaller. The host organism is larger, but the smaller active agent has an outsized, in fact, the dominant effect on the shape of things because it affects the host organism. And that's who we're supposed to be. Light of the world, city set on a hill. That force that cannot be ignored. Okay. We'll talk about the second couplet, those 2 short parables that talk about the value of the kingdom of God next time. Thank you for joining me for another 5 good minutes with the Word.